Hello and welcome. My name is Oriana Guadalupe Vallejo Hernandez. I'm a student in the major of English language at the Universidad Veracruzana. Today I would like to share with you some interesting and historical facts about one of the greatest exponent of critical pedagogy of the 20th century, Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire changed the perspective of orthodox pedagogy, influencing the new liberating ideas in Latin America in liberation theology. His figure is a constant reference in liberating politics and education. For example, in the 16th and 17th, he fought as a professor of justice and solidarity and thus against oppression. Paulo Reclus Neves Freire, better known as Paulo Freire, was born on September 19, in 1922, in the provincial of the capital of Recife, which is located in the northeast of Brazil, and grew up in a small bourgeois family. As we know, Paulo Freire was a pedagogy and philosopher, and a prominent defender of critical pedagogy. During the Great Depression in 1929, he knew poverty and hunger, which led him to dedicate his life to fight against hunger, and later this would lead him to help him forge his education perspective. In 1943, he entered to the University of Recife in the Faculty of Law, where he studied philosophy and psychology at the same time, and then he obtained his university degree from the Faculty of Law, but he never practiced law because he preferred to teach Portuguese in high school. In 1944, he married with Elsa Maya Costa de Oliveira, who was a primary school teacher. She was an important part of his life because they collaborated together for the rest of their lives. In 1946, Freire was appointed director of the Department of Education and Culture of the Social Service in the state of Pernambuco. So basically, his work consisted of teaching reading and writing poor people who were analphabets. It's at this point where Freire began to adopt an unorthodox method that can be considered a variation of liberation theology. This was because at that time reading and writing were essential requirements to vote in Brazil elections. But it's especially in the 60s and the 70s where, as I mentioned in the past, he fought as a professor of justice and solidarity. He was a very important part of the liberation movement, which was a popular movement that criticized the economic systems, but in a radical way. Uh, Thus, he thought that liberation from capitalism could be possible in another world. Then, in 1961, he was appointed director of the Department of Cultural Extension of the University of Recife, and then in 1962, he finally had the first opportunity to apply his theories in a meaningful way. Um, it was at this part where he thought to read and write 300 sugar plantation workers in 43 days, and in response of these good results, Brazilian government approved the creation of thousands cultural circles through the country. But in 1964, a military coup ended the project, so Freire was prisoner as a traitor for 70 days. And after a brief exile in Bolivia, Freire worked in Chile for 5 years for the Christian Democratic Movement, for agrarian reform and the food, and also for agriculture organizations of the United Nations. In 1967, Freire published a book which is called Education as a Practice of Freedom. Especially this book was well received, and thanks to this, he was offered the position of visiting professor at Harvard University. And then in 1969, he was reading his most famous book among educators and experts in pedagogy. This book is known as Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Finally, on May 2nd in 1997, at the age of 75, Paulo Freire passed away, but days before his death, he was still debating new prospects for education in the world, although his pedagogical thinking continues nowadays. It's for that reason that it is considered Paulo Freire's contribution to critical literacy as an obligatory reference in the new sociocultural approaches for reading and writing in the contemporary world, as well as his critical theories and new literacy studies. So, based on his past and all his contributions, Freire presents us the education as an instrument of emancipation from the oppressed, this being the pure example of freedom and love of the part of humanity, which mixes the autonomy of social consciousness, the values of justice, freedom, and equality of people. Basis of Freire's educational theories. The basis of these theories are built into the practice, since otherwise, and according to Freire, the unpractical theory becomes the only discourse, and thus it becomes a senseless discourse. Freire observed the relationship between education and society as the transmission of ideologies by the ruling class made the class dominated. For Freire, the pedagogy is built as one of the oppressed and not as one for the oppressed, since this seeks deliberation through themselves. And also, for Freire, man has an essential characteristic, which is his awareness of himself and his environment, which can be by modifying through that same environment, but with a critical attitude. Um, it's very important to say and consider these two bases because due to these two bases is are the most of his theories built. But first of all, I would like to comment about some interesting and famous Paulo Freire's works that has a great impact in pedagogy nowadays and also in the past. I decided to choose 5 of them. The first one was Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and the second one was the Pedagogy of the Autonomy. The third one, Education for Critical Consciousness, the importance of reading and letters to those who they're teaching. I decided to choose these 5 books because I think all of them have a great importance in learning and teaching in a foreign language also. But mainly because I think all of them have a great relation, especially for all of us that we are students, that we are in process of becoming a teacher in the future. I would like to start talking about Pedagogy of the Oppressed. First of all, because it's one of the most important and famous works of Paulo Freire, and also because it is a critic of the traditional education of the oppressors. He also calls this education as a baking education, because in this type of teaching, the teacher is the main subject of education, and the student is the person who receives all the contents of wisdom. The teacher's task is to fill the learners with the contents of their knowledge. So in this baking conception of education, it is supposed that the good educator is one who best fills the containers in the students' deposits. So also it is supposed will be the best educating the one who allows himself to fill the containers and learn them with a love of memorization. The next point is students' role. Students of traditional education are passive, so they receive a lot of knowledge which are safe and filled, but without any active purposes. So in this sense, Freire argues that the more passivity, the more easily the oppressed will adapt to the world, and the further they will be from transforming reality. banking education is therefore an instrument of oppression. As I previously commented in the pedagogy of the oppressed, it is focused on traditional and passive pedagogy, but pedagogy of autonomy shows us another perspective of education. In the text Pedagogy of Autonomy, Paulo Freire talks about what teachers should know in the teaching and learning process, but from an education perspective focused or directed toward equality and even the inclusion of all of individuals in society. For him, educating and teaching demand dialogue and respect for the learning and for the conception of the world. And for that reason, he points out that education is based on the interaction between educating and learning, and this requires the following steps. So, requires observing a methodological rigor, develops research, respect for the particular knowledge of each student, and most importantly, critical reflection and rejection of any form of discrimination. The next book which I'm going to talk about is Education for Critical Consciousness. In this book, Freire emphasized the importance of the role of educator, as well as his teaching task, that is not only to teach the content, but also to teach to think correctly. Freire defines critical awareness as a continuous process by which a student advances toward critical awareness. This process is the heart of liberating education. In other words, it is the ability to recognize the oppressive social forces that shape society and act against them. This with the objective of obtaining functional literacy as transformative literacy. The next text is the importance of reading. In this text, Paulo Freire talks about the critical understanding of the act of reading. He finds a dynamic relationship between the language and the reality, where the theory of the written word or the language is not enough. Freire thought that the knowledge is not transmitted. He thought that it is being built. So the educational act does not consist of transmission of knowledge, but the enjoyment of the construction of a common world. This theory is very important because, especially in the process of learning and teaching a foreign language, because if the students doesn't have or doesn't find a relation between the language and his or her reality, he will construct a lot of structures or a lot of information, but senseless. The next text is the letters who those intend to teach. In this book, Freire mentions that the educator must be willing to teach as much as to learn from his students or her students, and also in this sense of teaching and learning must be done in an open and critical way. In this work, Freire also mentioned that it is important to remove the fear of failure, but above all, having love for the profession, because if you do not love the profession, then you will only be discrediting and building negative emotions and experiences in you and in your students. According to Freire, these are some aspects that as future educators we must take into account when teaching, since educating is not an easy process. So the first one is teaching requires aspects for knowledge of learners. Teaching requires security, professionalism, ability, and generosity. Teaching does not exist without learning. The educator has a rich moment of learning in the act of teaching. And finally, it is that teaching does not exist without learning. These aspects are very important in education, because if you are prepared professor, you will build better experiences in your students. So the process of learning and acquiring information will be successful. In summary, here is a list of his most important theories implicit in the books that I already mentioned. So the first one is the theory of value. This theory refers to the education that should raise the awareness of the students, so they become subjects rather than objects of the world. This is done by teaching students to think critically everything that they learn. The second one is the theory of learning. In this theory, Freire talks about education as a system like a bank, a large repository where students come to withdraw the knowledge that they need for the life in a passive way. But students, in this case, must construct knowledge from knowledge they already possess. Teachers, in this case, must learn how the students understands the world, so that the teacher understands how the students can learn. The third one is the theory of transmission, where Freire assumed that teaching is a political process because the teacher must learn about and also from the student, so that knowledge can be constructed in ways that are meaningful to the student, and also the teacher must become learners, and the learners must become teachers. So it's a symbiotic process. Paulo Freire has a relevant impact in education in general, but also it has a relevant impact in education and learning of a foreign language. For example, he taught us that motivation on the part of the teachers and the students is very important, since motivation is what opens the way not only to learning but also to acquisition of all available information. Another relevant aspect is literacy and reading, because it is very necessary to follow and build the active dialogue method and critical in students. Also, we have the creation of good experiences in our students, and this because if we create good experiences in the students, they will also have good results in their learning process. Another important aspect is the creativity and awareness of the information, as it encourages both the students and the teacher to move toward critical thinking, to question their environment and also their reality. The next one, but not less important, be active and not only provide information. And this because, as we saw in the text, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Orthodox education only works to create people without a critical sense and the question about what happens around them. And finally, we have the creation of relationship between language and reality to understand the learning and acquisition process for both teachers and students. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.